Alright, hello and welcome. So, it is time again to go over all of the Warframes and where they stand right now. So, they will be given grades, and I'm going to explain what those grades mean for each Warframe. So, there are 5 sections, essentially, which is S, A, B, C, D. There are very few frames in S and D, but they are there nonetheless. S, this is for frames that are very heavily meta, and are kind of just good at literally everything. There's not a single situation you can put them in where it wouldn't be highly advantageous to have them on a team, and they just trivialize content, essentially, in a really, really big way. For example, Trinity here was in S. She has changed now because of the changes to Blessing. It used to be that she had 99% damage reduction she could give to the entire party at any range. Turns out, that's super game-breaking, and it's why it was changed. S is kind of reserved for those Warframes. A rank. A rank is for Warframes that are in a really good spot, have a lot of uses, you can use them everywhere, and no one would be like, oh, why are you using that here? It's like their power sets are very varied, they have a lot of capabilities to do things, they have advantages in a lot of ways, there's a lot of fields that they're really good in. Warframes that are in B rank. So, B rank is for Warframes that generally need either just small changes or are just lesser in a whole lot of smaller ways than the Warframes that are in A rank. They're just weaker versions of Warframes we already have a lot of the time, and they just don't really come together very well. Warframes in C rank. So, C rank and B rank are kind of the same area, but C rank is specifically for Warframes that really only boil down to one ability. Warframes like, let's say, Banshee, for example. Banshee has incredibly niche uses, mostly surrounding sonar, and while there are other builds for her, that's the one that Banshee is used for in general. And it's not to say that the frames in C rank can't be played, but they're just very niche, and they don't have a lot of advantages in general when you compare them to Warframes that are in the A rank. D rank is for Warframes that there's not really any reason to play. Warframes that are outclassed even by Warframes in C rank that have even like only one use, and are generally just not worth farming for or even playing at all unless you really, really need the mastery. That's kind of the very basic breakdown of the grades. Some Warframes are kind of in between C and B in a weird way. But let's just get this started, because this could take some time. But let's start with Ashe. So, Ashe was a B+. Not a lot has changed for Ashe. He got his passive, he's still a B+. His passive adds some more damage to him, which is not really a huge deal. It's worth noting that Ashe is very soon on the table to get changed. The big thing that Ashe does right now that people are using him for is his 4. And what I mean by that is people are just building only for his 4 and just spamming it to kill enemies very, very quickly. They're looking into changing that and making that ability more interactive. Whether or not that will be good for him, I can't say. I wanted his 4 to be changed for quite some time. But, on the other hand, Ashe has a decent 3, opens enemies up for finishers. His 1 is quite good, it does decent damage for a 1 even. I would like to see it have more functionality with his other abilities, I guess I should say. And his 2 is like a lesser version of Loki's invisibility, which is, of course, incredibly powerful. So, he's got a kit that's got a lot going on, but whether or not the Blade Store changes are good are going to completely determine whether or not Ashe is like a fully featured Warframe in the end. Because right now, if you're using Bladestorm is actually a good way to get yourself killed as Ashe, in a lot of cases, outside of using very specific combinations of things. He's an alright Warframe that is just... he's kind of just being abused right now, really, and I don't really think many people are using him as the other things that he has the potential to be. But, he's okay. Atlas. So, Atlas is a Warframe I really love the concept of, but that just doesn't really work very well. His 1 is arguably, like, no problem top 3 ones in the game, if not, like, 1 or 2. It's a very, very powerful one that works really, really well. Scales with melee mods, does a ton of damage, has a combo, like, it's good area of effect, it's just very powerful in general. Atlas's passive is arguably the best in the game, it's very, very powerful. Actually, second to Inaros. Inaros definitely has the best passives in the game, that's almost certain. But after you get past his 1, the rest of his kit just doesn't come together. His Tectonics is weak, even with the augment it's not very useful. Having it, like, roll is kind of nothing, and there's no, like, interplay between his abilities there. Petrify is slow, it's much like Chroma's 1. Whenever you freeze enemies, it takes a long time. The area is not really that large for that kind of crowd control that's locking you out of using your guns and, like, all your other abilities. And then you also have his 4. And then his 4 is summoning Rumblers. And even with the augment, that doesn't really take aggro the way I wish it did. They're just... The Rumblers are stupid. The Rumblers suffer the problem of not being able to do... Like, they're just dumb. They're much like Kubros, where they're just kind of... They're there, but they're not really doing a whole lot. And it's definitely not really deserving of being considered the power of a 4. They don't do a whole lot. So while Atlas is cool, he's still a B rank. Yeah, it's unfortunate. He's just... There's no... If there was interplay with his abilities, he would be so much better. And just doing something more interesting that builds off of his already amazing 1 would be so nice. Moving on, though, we've got Banshee. So, Banshee is a C+, and she has remained a C+. However, Banshee is the Warframe in C rank that is the closest to being an A+. So, Banshee has a really interesting subset of powers that I think are plagued by an inconsistency problem, or having downsides that are not really helping Banshee, or downsides that are not keeping with consistency to Banshee. So, she's got her 2. Her 2 is fantastic. It's a large damage increase for the entire party. Its augment is very, very good. Her 1 is quite strong. It's got a good range to it. Its augment can strip armor. That's very useful. Her 3, however, unless you build for negative duration, which pretty much just kills, like, her main abilities, her 2 and her 4, then it's just not very useful because the stun's not consistent enough, and you can't really count on it whenever you need it. If her 3 was recastable, it would instantly... Banshee would shoot up from C+ to A+ instantaneously. Her 4 is really solid. The new augment she got for her 4 is actually pretty good. Like, Banshee is just a Warframe that is not consistent enough in her ability to do things without, like, if you're like a super high skill player, it's like gonna be no problem for you to play Banshee, but it's just for in the vast majority of cases, it's just not where it needs to be. It's just one little pip away from being totally perfect, and it's really unfortunate. But that's Banshee. If you want a Warframe that is... if you want to be a glass cannon, Banshee is probably the best way to be as glass as possible and as cannon as possible. So shoot for that. Chroma. So, Chroma is a Warframe that is a hell of a lot of fun. I'll definitely say that. He's really interesting, but unfortunately, he was a B+, and he's still a B+, and actually, much like Banshee, he is the Warframe that is in B rank that is the closest to getting out of it. His 4 is pretty weak, but it's fine. His 1 is pretty weak, but... Well, actually, no, his 1 is just actually pretty terrible. His 1 is completely useless, actually, and should be something else entirely. However, his 3 is a really good ability, and his 2 is a ability that builds on his 3. They work really well together, and there's a lot of stuff you can do to just make Chroma really, really hard to kill, and just murder enemies for a while. Chroma has this problem where he's not consistent in his ability to be a tank. He has moments of weakness that are really, really pronounced, in that every time you have to re-up Vex armor, you're vulnerable to being just instantly murdered. And at higher levels, you will be instantly murdered, essentially, like, with Vex armor, due to the way that it's interacting with your shields and your health, like, before it can ramp up it's very easy to just outright die as Chroma, which is really unfortunate. Chroma can be played really well, but I would like to see tweaks to his abilities, specifically the recastability of his Elemental Ward and the refreshability of his Vex armor would instantly push him into A rank, no problem. His consistency would be way, way up, and he would be just a lot better in general. Moving on, though, we've got another Warframe that has not changed very much. Ember. So, Ember is a Warframe that is fine, and she was a B rank, and she stayed a B rank, and nothing has really changed for her. Her 1 is acceptable, her 2 is actually pretty good, her 4 is quite a good ability, building around it, its augment is quite good, there's a lot you can do there. I think the problem mainly right now with Ember is her 3. Ember's 3 right now is not really doing anything for her that her other abilities aren't already accomplishing, and it would be nice to see Ember, instead of the 3 that she has now, have that be removed and instead be replaced with an ability that allows her to get in closer with enemies and be safer around them, because she wants to get close and kill enemies. Making her more of a caster that gets in close on enemies would be really nice, because right now Accelerant and World on Fire are a little inconsistent for actually getting near enemies. But she's alright. She's okay. Moving on, we have Equinox. So, Equinox is a Warframe that has 7 abilities. Metamorphosis switches you between the 3 on either side, day and night. Unfortunately, only 2 out of 7 are really any good. Metamorphosis is not really anything to write home about. You're generally just going to want to stay in one form and use whichever power you built around and just chill there, essentially. Rest on the night side is a very good ability, especially with its augment that lets it spread. And it's good on its own. Unfortunately, whenever you're in the night mode, you have Mend, which doesn't really do anything, and it's a heal that isn't really helping anyone. And then you've got Pacify, which is too restrictive and doesn't really do anything for you. On the day side, you've got Rage, which is an ability that has a built-in downside just right off the bark. Just there it is, and there's not really a good reason to use it because Rest is significantly better in pretty much every way. Provoke, which has incredibly niche uses, it's just kind of nothing. It's not... no. I mean, you could buff on Draco, I guess. There's not really a good use for Provoke that you would ever actually be in for. And then Maim. Maim trading and just having the way that Maim works, spiral damage out with 2 Equinoxes, is a thing that exists, but is so incredibly niche, and most people will never encounter 2 Equinoxes actually doing that. But it's just all niche, and it ends up that Equinox is just a C+ Warframe. There's a couple reasons to use this Warframe, but they're all so niche, and the builds don't really mesh together in a good way. So unfortunately, Equinox could be a lot more self-synergized for a Warframe with 7 abilities. Moving on, we've got Excal. Excal. So, Excal just recently got changed again. He got a little bit of a nerf. He went from an A+, his abilities were incredible, he had long range with his 4, his range was taken down on his 4 a little bit, so he's just an A rank now. His 2 is still incredibly powerful, Slash Dash is still useful, Radial Javelin is a Draco thing that I really wish would get changed actually, but it is what it is. I wish that was a little more interplayed with the rest of his abilities, where if you blind enemies, then Radial Javelin does more damage, and if you have Exalted Blade out, then Radial Javelin does like an added effect or something. Those types of things would be nice to have more reason to use it at the higher level. But Exalted Blade also exists, and Exalted Blade is very, very good. It does a lot of damage, a huge amount of damage, and opening enemies up to finishers with Radial Blind will let you take down pretty much anything that can be finishered pretty much instantly. Pretty much. He's very, very good, mostly in solo. In groups, it's sometimes even a disadvantage to be using Radial Blind a lot, because many of the other melee-focused Warframes don't need to be doing finishers that often. and they have to get much closer than Excalibur to benefit from the extra finisher damage. And next we have Frost. So, Frost is a wonderful Warframe that also received some nerfs not terribly long ago. So he is no longer used in the raid, and because he can't freeze bosses anymore. With that, there's like some like tiny little things that I think would be nice to have changed about him, but he moved from an A+ to an A. Much like Excalibur, he's still incredibly good. Huge amounts of crowd control. His 3 is still the absolute meta for defense. His 2 is alright, and his 1 is pretty good in terms of a 1, actually. There's not a lot going on there. He's just a very solid Warframe that, I mean, I see a Frost, and it's like, sure. And in any mission, it's like, yeah, it's Frost. Absolutely. That's just, he just does everything to at least a good degree. Now for a Warframe that does pretty much nothing to a good degree. Hydroid. So, Hydroid is the absolute king of inconsistency, just in the hugest way. His 1 is hugely inconsistent, and it's just, like, it reacts poorly to positively increasing your stats, which is absurd. His 4 is also inconsistent, and the grabbing of enemies is not very useful, doesn't do a lot of damage. It has the augment for more loot, but we already have Nekros who's doing that. Undertow is an ability that exists, but it just locks you down into basically not playing the game, although you could use it in Interception, I guess. But there are way better options for that. And then Tidal Surge is like a discount Rhino charge. Or wait, no, it's a more expensive Rhino charge, actually. So, I guess there's that. Hydroid is the Warframe that I want to be reworked the most, because he's a D, and he's just a D. Don't use him. He's not worth it. He comes from the worst boss in the game. There's just no upside to this character. Unless you really need that extra loot for some reason, in which case bring Nekros and Ivara. There's nothing. He's the only D Warframe I've got here, and it's just a fucking shit show. Moving on to something that is not a shit show, Inaros. Inaros is a new Warframe, so he only has 1 rank, which is A+. This Warframe is phenomenal. All of his abilities have a different use. The only ability he has that is minorly weak is his Sandstorm. His 1 is fantastic, opens enemies to finishers. Going with his passive, which heals him for a large portion of his health whenever he finishes an enemy. Whenever he dies, he doesn't die. At low levels, it's basically impossible to die as Inaros. It's very, very powerful. His 2, letting you grapple enemies at range and then eat them to gain your health back. Also, you can turn them into, like, AI sand partners or whatever, and that's not really effective. But while you're devouring enemies, you're, like, immune to damage, and I think you're immune to crowd control as well, which is really, really powerful. And then you've got Scarab Swarm, which not only increases his armor once you charge it up by using your health, but also can be used as a large-scale crowd control mechanic that can just stop swarms of enemies in their tracks. And he's just really powerful. Couple that with having an enormous health pool. His EHP is incredibly high, and he's just very versatile, very powerful, an incredible solo frame. He's got a lot of CC with his 1 and his 4, and his 2 is also single target lockdown, and his 3 is also crowd control, but is a little bit lesser. He's just got everything going for him, except for his damage output, which can be supplemented by his ability to start up finishers and equipping a dagger, or just, like, having any high damage weapon. He just does everything. He does so much. Like, I can't really think of a situation where he's bad in. He's probably the best Warframe for hijack because he uses his health for the hijack instead, and he's good at regenerating his health. There's so many advantages to using Inaros. It's quite good. Also, the way you acquire him is not painful really in any way. It's quite easy. Moving on to another Warframe that is phenomenal and has remained phenomenal is Ivara. So, Ivara is another Warframe with 7 abilities, but this time we got 6 out of 7 right. So the only bad thing with her 1 is noise, which doesn't really do a whole lot in practice, but sleep arrows are really good, dash wires are useful, cloak arrows are quite good. Like, just on her 1, she's got 3 powers that are quite good. On her 2 is Navigator, which is a little bit niche, but can give you a nice damage boost whenever you need it for single targets. Can be used with, like, the Lanka, with bows. Like, you can use it with the glaive for fun. There's a lot of advantages to using Navigator whenever you really need to hit something very hard. With her 3, she has pretty much indefinite invisibility as long as you do it right. Like, extra loot from her 3 as a bonus. Your downside is that you're a little slow in your 3, which is not really a huge deal. The augment she just got for her 3 lets her pretty much super trivialize any spy vault, which is appropriate because she comes from doing pretty much every spy vault in the game. And then she's got Artemis Bow, which is an exalted weapon that scales off primary mods. That is a fan of arrows coming out of her bow. That does a shit ton of damage. And also gives you access to quick firing her 1. It's very good. There's no, like, she's just all the way around. She's got useful powers, and the noise arrow is the only thing that's kind of but it's got a use. It's just not really realistic that it will be used. And she's just a very incredible Warframe all around. There's not, like, the downside to using Ivara is that you have to walk minorly slower than most Warframes are, which is whatever. Then we've got Limbo. So, Limbo, since we last talked about him, for some reason, certain mechanics of the Rift have been nerfed. There's been a lot of, like, smaller changes that are just making him less viable, and he is the Warframe that is up for the next rework, which, thank God for that, because I really would like Limbo to be very good. He's got his 1, which lets him banish enemies into the Rift. His 2 lets him go to the Rift. Rift Surge gives him more damage in the Rift. And his 4 brings a bunch of enemies into the Rift, which is more often a downside than not. He's interesting, but he's just, like, slow, and his abilities are kind of clunky and cast pretty slow. And it just feels like everything to do with the Rift has been just worked against in a lot of ways. There's not really... There's not much here. He went from a C+ to a C-, and I really want his rework to be very good, because visually, I think he looks cool. It's a cool-looking Warframe. I want him to be good, but he's just not... There's not really a lot there right now. Like, he can be played, but there's not really a lot of reason to, unfortunately. Now we're going to move on to... Moving on to Loki. So, Loki is the only remaining S-rank Warframe, because he just trivializes fucking everything. His 1 is at low levels, just put it in an area enemies can't get to, and they'll all just look at it. His 2 is just really long, basically invulnerability, just, like, can't die, as long as you have more than... As long as you're using, like, more than 1% of your attention to make sure you don't die, there's pretty much no chance of it happening outside of some, like, AoEs you don't notice or something. His 3, combined with his 1, really good for getting around, teleport through barriers, do all kinds of shit. And his 4 essentially just turns enemies off. Like, any danger those enemies could have posed to your teammates is just completely removed with the removal of their weapons, basically turning any faction into the Infested, which the Infested are the weakest faction in the game by a pretty large margin. Just completely shutting down every situation. Having a Loki on a team is usually just pure benefit in every single scenario. It's kind of absurd. I personally don't I don't like Loki that much. I don't like playing as Loki, but he's fucking great. It's super absurd. Moving on from Loki, we've got Mag. So, Mag was also changed recently. She used to be a corpus killer with her Polarize that was very niche. I mean, it was nice, though. You could trivialize any corpus mission. I think it was terrible, and it definitely needed to be changed. But they changed her to essentially... Instead of having Polarize, you've got Magnetize now, which is... It works on more factions, but it's just like... You're just killing enemies that are in the Magnetize in a very small area, and it's just... There's not a whole lot... Like, you're just hitting 2 a lot. There's not... Like, the synergy that exists within her kit, it's not really actually useful. There's no reason to do a lot of it. She does have minor advantages against some bosses, which is fine. And single targets, she's good against, but There's not really a whole lot of reason to play as her, and she's definitely the worst starter by a pretty... New players, please do not. Mag is not good for beginners. You need a lot of mods to get her to a place where she's even advantageous at all. So she went from a C+ to a C-. Hopefully they do some more work to her kit to make her 3 and her 4, like, do more. And it's not that I want Polarize back to killing all the enemies. I just wish it did a better debuff and helped your team more. And then Crush just needs to be fucking removed, because that ability is terrible. But yeah, that's Mag. So let's move on to a brighter rework. Mesa. So, Mesa went from a B+ to an A+. She is incredibly good now. Her 2 has always been good. It was... well, her 2 was always okay. Her 2 has been changed so that the buff stays on her, and also goes to your teammates, which is incredibly good. It's a good damage buff. It's got some shutdown for enemies in your immediate vicinity. It's quite nice. Combined with Shatter Shield, which is 95% damage reduction on ranged weaponry. Very powerful. Doesn't protect you from melee, which is fine. And it's a very solid set of 2 and 3 to make her quite defensive. Combined with her 4, now scaling with secondary mods, it can do a lot of damage. Whenever you're fully focused with Peacemaker, you can push out some very, very just high single target DPS, which is really, really just fantastic. And it starts at a good spread so you can clean up trash mobs. The only problem with Mesa remaining is that her 1 still has a cap on the damage, so there's not really any scalability there past, like, let's say, level 40. But otherwise, Mesa is incredible, and I think that her, much like the Warframe we're about to talk about, Nova, well, that's in a little bit, actually. She's very, very close to perfect. Very, very close. Moving on, though, we've got Mirage. So, Mirage was nerfed. She has gone from an A to a B+. She was in A rank because Prism could shut down pretty much everything, and the combination of her 1 and her 3 is also incredibly strong. Like, her 1, her 3, and her 4 are all good abilities that are fine. Her 3 has always been a little clunky, and her 1 has always been quite good, combined with a large variety of weapons. Her 4 being nerfed, it's at about the power level that Excal's 2 is now. In fact, they have the exact same range, and I believe Excal starts at more duration. Hers just costs more energy with a higher cast time, which is pretty unfortunate. And her 2 has remained pretty much completely useless, so boiling her down to basically being a frame that hits 1 and 3 that can do a lot of damage. There's some tweaks in there I would like to see. I think that she would have remained in A rank if whenever they changed Prism, they had buffed the casting speed while removing its line of sight. But unfortunately, it is what it is, and there's just not a whole lot of Mirage usage now that I see. She's still fine, but I think there are better choices than her at this point. Moving on, we've got Nekros. Nekros has not changed. He was a B, and he has remained a B. He's got the Shadows of the Dead build, which is fine for solos, but doesn't really bring a whole lot to the table in terms of anything else, really. Terrify is alright at best, and the main thing that Nekros is used for is just being a Desecrate slave, where you just constantly hit 3 and basically don't play the game. He's a cool Warframe that just doesn't really have any real reason to play him outside of just being someone's loot slave for a mission. It's pretty unfortunate. But yeah, that's Nekros. He can be pretty tanky with the Shadows of the Dead augment stuff, but there's not really a lot of reason to be him otherwise. Moving on, though, we've got Nezha. So, Nezha is a Warframe I kind of turned around a little bit on. He was quite new whenever I had last done, like, this roster review. Nezha is just a discount Rhino, but Rhino is very good. Rhino is a very good Warframe, and being a discount Rhino turns out is not that bad. So we went from a C- to a B-. He's just he needs some just little tweaks. His Firewalker is alright, combining it with Blazing Chakram is pretty clunky, but is okay. His 3 is just a more expensive Iron Skin that is less durable, and you get a tiny little baby crowd control on it, but it's not really actually that strong. And there's just not a lot there. His Divine Spears is pretty much just a worse version of Rhino's 4 as well. It covers a smaller area, it has a much longer cast time, it has double cast, there's more enemies that are immune to it. There's just not a whole lot of reasons to use it. Besides Nezha being quick, and that's the main thing with Nezha that I think makes him fun, is that you can just slide around super fast, and that's highly advantageous to some people, and I'm sure a lot of people are going to enjoy that, but there's just not a lot of actual reason to use Nezha, I find, outside of enjoying him. Like, the actual technical reasons to use him are not in great supply. But, moving on to Nova. So, Nova, much like Mesa, is a Warframe that is just a tweak on her 1 away from being pretty much perfect. Her 2 is phenomenal DPS, combined with a good high base damage weapon. You can fill it up very quickly, do a ton of damage. Her 4 is amazing crowd control, lowering the speed of enemies by 75%, and doubling the damage you're doing to them, and they explode when they die. Her 3 is really good mobility. The only bad thing she's got for her is her Null Star, which is just not enough of a reason to use. Although, I will say that if they made the one little tweak to Null Star, which is to have it proc blast every time it hits an enemy, perfect Warframe. There would be pretty much no downside to ever using Nova. She's got her Spiva build for low-level farming. There's so many things that she can do. There's not really any situation where having a Nova is bad outside of if it is a low-level farm and it's a Slova for some reason that has shown up to your party, which is just more of an inconvenience than actually making the mission harder, because it's making the mission way easier. It's just longer. It's just, Nova is an A+, and she's remained an A+. She's incredibly good. Now we're going to move on to Nyx. So, I think I may have been giving Nyx too much credit for too long. She went from an A- to a B+. So, the reason that I say that is I think I've been giving Nyx too much credit in that Nyx doesn't do enough. Her 2 is terrible. Her 3 is a thing that Loki can do, and she has some stuff that it's fine. Her 1 is control an enemy, but that's not actually very useful because the enemy AI is so bad when they're on your side. Her absorb, it makes her invincible for a little while, but just locks her in place, and it's not really a lot to do there. So, while I like Nyx, and I think that she can be successful, I think that's kind of what it is, and there's not really actually a lot of reasons to use Nyx. Her 2 is just awful. Her 3 is just, is trying to be Loki in a way that has become so apparent that Loki is just better in so many different possible ways, and that her 1, her 2, and her 4 just aren't that great. And it's mostly due to the AI just not being able to combat themselves effectively, which is unfortunate. I would like to see her changed in some way to be more micro, in that I want her to be able to, maximize the effectiveness of, having control abilities. These enemies move over here, more micro in controlling a horde of enemies, I think would probably be able to push her back into A rank. But to be honest, in terms of a mind control frame, there's not a whole lot I can think to do with her to make her much better. And that's just kind of, and over time, the state of the game has gotten to a place where Nyx is just less and less useful, unfortunately. Next up, we've got Oberon. So, Oberon went from a B- to a B. And Oberon has always been alright. His 1 is fine. His 2 is pretty bad. His 3 is, and his 4 is about the power level of a 3. It's all okay. So why, you might be asking, did Oberon's grade go up? Well, it's because Oberon secured himself a place for now, until the healing Arcwing comes out, most likely, in Jordis Verdict, in that he can heal the Arcwings while he is inside Jordis, unlike what Trinity used to be able to do it, which is why Trinity was used for that. But now Trinity can't do it, and Oberon is the only remaining character that can heal the Arcwings. So that's why his grade went up. I really would like to see Oberon reworked and really fulfill his paladin status and be a lot better. But he's just a Warframe that has just a lot of subpar stuff. Just a lot of not very useful abilities that are just functional, but just okay, really. Unfortunate. Moving on from Oberon, we've got Rhino. That's the prime one. Rhino. So, Rhino is quite good. For beginners, this is the Warframe that I would suggest you just immediately go and farm. You can get him from Venus incredibly early on. He reacts very well to having no mods, and once you have a bunch of mods, he's very, very powerful. His augments, Iron Charge and Iron Shrapnel, or Ironclad Charge and Iron Shrapnel, are both fantastic. They make him very, very difficult to kill. His 4 is among the best crowd control in the game. His 3 is a nice damage boost. His 1 has crowd control attached to it. That's pretty good. You can get a lot of ground finishers that way. There's a lot of advantages to using Rhino in a lot of different... Actually, pretty much the entire game through. From the moment you can get Rhino, it's a good idea to get Rhino. And then once you have, way better mods, it's still good to play Rhino. He's just a very, very solid Warframe. He is just solid. He's an A. He's just an A. And has remained that way. Very powerful. So, now we're going to talk about Saryn. So, Saryn is kind of another failed rework, in that Saryn basically boils down to having her spores to debuff enemies, but on Saryn's side, she's also, in general, pretty hard to kill. If you use the augment for her molt, she gets good health regeneration, she has a fairly large health pool, and it's pretty hard to kill her. Her Toxic Lash is kind of a nothing ability. You can do melee with her with Naramon, but you could fucking do that with literally any Warframe and be successful, so that's not really applicable. Her Miasma is pretty weak. It's got a tiny little stun in it, and its damage doesn't really do a whole lot. But just between Spores and Molt, you can do enough with Saryn. She's a B. I was going to say C. I don't know why I was going to say C. She's just a B. Just a B. Whenever you can get Saryn in the star chart, she's fine. I wish her rework was better, but it's just alright. In the higher end, she's generally just going to be a discount Nova, but you can use her on Draco, so it's fine, I guess. Moving on is Trinity. So, this is one of the big changes. So, Trinity does not have 99 Bless anymore. That is not a thing that exists anymore. However, from her initial nerf, where Bless was dead, in the ground, 6 feet under, Gonskis, they instead have changed it once again. Now it maxes out at 75% damage reduction, and it is much easier to do, in that you don't need a self-damage weapon or anything, you just cast it and it happens, and the range has been taken to 50 meters unmoddable. I think you can increase it with Vazarin, but I have not tested that myself, so don't take my word on that one. I'm pretty sure you can increase it with some of the Vazarin passives, but take that with a grain of salt. Her 2 is still phenomenal. Blessing is still very good. Using it in LOR and such is still very powerful. She can still tank by herself. Link is a lot more valuable now because of the loss of the 99% Bless, where Link was just an ability why do I fucking have this? Beyond that, her 1 is useful for lockdown, her 2 also locks down single enemies. These things are good. Trinity is a good support Warframe. She's pretty much the only support Warframe in the game, really, and she's still fantastic. She went from an S to an A+. Still a very, very powerful Warframe that I would be happy to see anywhere. Alright, next we're going to talk about Valkyr, and full disclosure, this is my favorite Warframe in the game. I really like Valkyr. A lot. But she got nerfed a little bit, and it's definitely worth talking about. She's gone from an A to an A-. So, Hysteria costs a lot more energy to use now, and it is more dangerous. It's still really powerful, and her 2 is still good with Eternal War. That's still very good. Her 1 is a weak ability. That's just for Spider-Manning around. It's just kind of a gimmick. And her 3 is only minorly useful and could easily just be rolled into her 4 and give her a new 3, and that would be fine. But her 4 is of such power still that I think that she goes into A rank because she's useful in so many situations. Using her as a ringer for a team that like might go down, like she will be able to res you. If Valkyr is not able to res you, you are in a situation where you should fucking not be in. She's just really good and still an incredible solo frame. Just a little bit worse. Her nerf was a little bit harder than Excal's, but she's still quite powerful. Moving on, we've got Vauban. So, Vauban's 2 was changed from Bounce to Mind Layer. And originally I thought that that was going to be a good thing, but it brought me back around to playing Vauban some more. And he's gone from an A to an A-. His 1 is still kind of nothing. It's a lot of fun, but it's pretty much nothing. Inside Mind Layer, you've got Bounce, which is still bleh. You've got his Shred Mine, which gets rid of some armor for a certain duration, and also it's just, like, you need too much power strength to make it worthwhile. It's just not worth throwing. Throwing his 2 is a really, really slow process that's really not worth it in general. His Trip Mines are gimmicky, and they're kind of eh. And then he's got his concussion ones, which are good, but you just can't throw them fast enough to make them effective. So there's not really a lot there. I think that Vauban would probably regain, like, out of his minus state in A, just by, like, flopping the way you activate his 2, by making it hold to switch and tap to throw. I think that would make Vauban a lot better with his new Mind Layer ability. And then otherwise, Bastille is still very good. Vortex is still fine. I think they fall short of a lot of other crowd control in the game. But he's still good. He's still really just a good Warframe. But I think he's just kind of losing favor. I was hoping that whenever they changed him that they were going to do a little more. On the plus side, his Prime looks fucking great. Moving on to another Warframe that has been changed. Volt. So, this is the last starter that we have not talked about yet. So they reworked Volt, and they like completely took out his 4, well, essentially, and changed it to Discharge. But let's talk about his other abilities first. So his 1 is, and has always been, quite good. It's a very solid 1, very good first power, really great for beginners. His 2, going fast. The quality of life improvements to his 2 are now, like, at the full, like, they're at their head. Their speed is a wonderful ability. Building around speed, going super fast, has never been more convenient than it is now. It's very, very nice. And his 3, Electric Shield, receives some quality of life improvements. In general, you can pick it up now, which is very powerful. It blocks Bombard rockets, which you can't say about a lot of abilities. That stuff is all fantastic. I think the place where Volt is still falling short is his 4. The mechanics behind how his 4 works right now don't really mesh with his 1, his 2, and his 3 right now. And what I mean by that is, okay, so his 4 is affected by range, which gives it the range that it goes out. Which, that type of ability, as we've seen with Polarize and Nova's 4, usually that wave-based expansion is based on duration, which is a stat that has been important for Volt in the rest of his abilities already, aside from Shock. But the main bulk of his abilities, his 2 and his 3. Duration is really good there, so you would think it would make sense for his range to be based on duration and kind of with the way that it waves out, and it doesn't just instantly hit that range, which is usually how range is treated. And then the range would be enemies affecting each other inside, like, whenever they're turned into pylons with his 4. The other bad thing is that when they're turned into pylons, with your strength, which is counter to your range, and the duration goes on how long this can be for, there's a cap on how much damage an enemy can take that is incredibly low. So, the only time you're actually getting the full bulk of the stun out of this ability and having it be more consistent is whenever enemies are very, very heavily armored. But at that point, there's not... Like, the 4 should be more inclusive into his kit, because it feels like it's a power that exists outside of Volt that is for another Warframe entirely in a lot of ways. Basically, if they remove the damage cap and brought the duration of it down in line and made it more consistent, and then changed it to the same kind of expansive range with duration instead of range, like we've seen with the way Max Polarize now works and the way Nova's 4 works, I think it would be an amazing ability. But as it stands, Volt went from a B- to a B+. The improvements to him are really nice, but I think that he needs that 4 to bring his kit, like, fully together. And once he has it, then he'll be amazing. He would probably shoot from a B+ straight to an A+ even. But it's just, it's too clunky, it's inconsistent, and it's not really worth building around. It's better just to focus on his 2 and his 3, which is what people were already doing. Which is quite unfortunate. That being said, Volt is still really fun. Choosing between him and Excal for beginners, I think, is do what you want. They're totally fine choices each. They have their own advantages as starters. For the first, like, part of the game, they're both absolutely fine. I think it's just, like, at the ending, like, point where you're worried about the consistency of a Warframe and that kind of stuff, that's where Volt falls a little short of Excal, which is a little unfortunate. Moving on, a Warframe that has not changed at all and nobody talks about, Wukong. So, Wukong was an A-, he stayed an A-. He's pretty much invincible with his 2. He's incredibly hard to kill. His 1 is basically useless. His 3 is neat, but you're not really going to use it that often. And Primal Fury is worse than just having a melee weapon now. But, like, he can kind of just... Like, the thing about Wukong is that he can just do whatever the fuck he wants. He can just do, like, anything that he wants to go do. Because Defy exists and Cloudwalker exists, just do. There's no downside to him just being there. He can't really die. Like, if you needed a... Like, if you were just someone who wanted to just spectate Warframe... Like, if you wanted a spectator mode in Warframe, but you didn't want to be dead, let's play as Wukong. You just, like, go into a mission with a lotto, hit 2, drop some energy packs, just walk around and look at shit. He doesn't really have to worry about anything. Unfortunately, his augment didn't really make Primal Fury more viable than just having a regular melee weapon, but he's got so many advantages to, like, just being in missions and just fucking doing them, much in the way that Loki does missions, where he's not really even paying attention to, like, the parameters of the mission. He's just looking at the objective and just doing it, because he doesn't have to care about the enemies around him. But that's kind of what Wukong does. The more I talk about this, the more I'm not 100% certain he should be an A. That one might be revised soon. But, let's move on for now to Zephyr. So, Zephyr was a B and has remained a B. She's okay. Turbulence is fine. It's a nice defensive ability. Her tornadoes are alright. I wish they didn't fling enemies about as much as they do, and they were like moving vortexes and brought enemies together, so you was more easily to eliminate them. Her 1 and her 2 were pretty much outclassed by just using fucking parkour. Like, our abilities to jump around pretty much completely take out the need for her 1 and her 2. Her 2 could easily be rolled into her 1 if her 1 was needed to be kept. There are now Warframes that have better true flight than Zephyr does, who is supposed to be the Warframe that flies. Her passive doesn't do a lot for her. She's fine, but I think she needs some tweaks to be on her own, like, oh yeah, use that. But yeah, that's Zephyr. And that's all the Warframes. So, I hope you guys enjoyed this, and I'll see you guys tomorrow.